Have you ever really thought about how different the banking worlds are in the US and Canada? I mean, they share the longest border in the world, but when it comes to their financial systems, they are almost complete opposites. So let's get into how this massive divide actually happened. Okay, just look at these numbers for a second. In the United States, you have somewhere around 4,500 federally insured banks. And then you look north to Canada, and there are only about 80. That isn't just a small gap, that is a canyon. It's like comparing a huge, bustling marketplace with thousands of stalls to a city that only has a handful of giant superstores. So the obvious question is, how? How on earth did this happen? Was it just some historical accident, or was it a deliberate choice? Well, as we're about to find out, the answer is this fascinating mix of philosophy, politics, and one single law that literally sent these two nations down completely different roads. To really get the American side of the story, you have to understand something that's baked into the American identity, a deep, almost instinctual suspicion of concentrated power, especially when it comes to money. Yeah, this quote right here nails it. From the get-go, there was this intense fear of creating a single, powerful national bank like the ones they had in Europe. The whole idea was that power should be spread out, kept local, and be accountable to the community. This wasn't just a policy, it was a core philosophy. And this philosophy led to something called unit banking. The dream was this landscape dotted with thousands and thousands of independent, community-focused banks, each one deeply connected to its local economy. The very idea of one single bank having branches all over the country, well, it just felt a little bit un-American. And that preference really set the stage for everything that was to come. What's wild is that both countries actually started out on a pretty similar track. They were both experimenting with branch banking early on. But then came this critical fork in the road, a moment right in the middle of the American Civil War that would end up locking each country into its financial destiny for good. So before we dive into that, let's just make sure we're on the same page with the terms. The US ended up with a unit banking model, thousands of separate banks. Canada, on the other hand, went all in on branching banking, just a few massive banks with branches everywhere. These are two totally different ways to structure a financial system. Right, so that crucial moment was the National Bank Act back in the 1860s. But what's absolutely fascinating is that the law's most lasting impact, the thing that basically banned bank branches, was a total and complete accident. The law was actually trying to solve a totally different and frankly much wilder problem. See, back then, individual banks could issue their own money, and a really common scam was to set up a bank in the middle of a swamp or some remote forest, print a ton of banknotes, and then make it physically impossible for anyone to ever show up and redeem them for gold or silver. So to stop these phantom banks, the act said every national bank had to specify one single place of business. The unintended consequence? Everyone interpreted that to mean banks couldn't have branches. And just like that, the US was locked onto the path of unit banking. All right, so let's fast forward to today. How have these century-old decisions actually played out in the modern world? Well, they've created two systems with a really clear trade-off: stability on one side versus competition on the other. This table really lays out the core dilemma. On one hand, you've got the US system, which encourages just a massive amount of competition and innovation. But its big weakness is vulnerability. Then you have Canada's super concentrated system, which is incredibly stable. But that safety often comes at the cost of higher fees and less choice for consumers. Let's zero in on Canada for a sec. Just 6 banks, the Big Six, control almost the entire market. This makes it incredibly easy for one single regulator, the OSFI, to keep a really close eye on things. And that structure encourages a very conservative, risk-averse culture. The proof, as they say, is in the pudding. During the 2008 global financial meltdown, Canadian banks were famously some of the most stable in the entire world. Now, think about this number, 43. Since Canada created its deposit insurance system back in 1967, there have been exactly 43 bank failures. But here's the kicker. In all of those cases, not a single Canadian has ever lost a single dollar of their insured deposits. It's a truly incredible track record of stability. So we've got these two very different models, right? But here's the twist in our story. The famously fragmented, decentralized American system is starting to look a little more Canadian. I mean, just look at this chart. The shift is dramatic. In just under 2 decades, the number of banks in the US has been slashed by nearly half. That whole era of having a local bank in every small town is, well, it's rapidly coming to an end. The system is consolidating, and it is consolidating fast. So what's behind this? It really boils down to a few key things. After the 2008 crisis, regulations got a lot tougher and more expensive to comply with, which made it really hard for small banks to keep up. At the same time, you have the massive cost of new technology, things like fancy mobile banking apps, that makes it almost impossible to compete with giants like Chase or Bank of America. The logical result? A massive wave of mergers. But as the US system gets more and more concentrated, it starts to face an identity crisis. Fewer local banks could mean less access to loans for small businesses, especially in rural America. We're seeing the return of the too big to fail problem, which was at the very heart of the 2008 crisis. And there's a real risk that America could lose the very things that made its system unique, that fierce competition and endless consumer choice. And that really brings us to the final big question. You have two neighbors, two radically different systems, each one born from its own unique history and philosophy. One chose stability through concentration, the other chose competition through decentralization. But as technology and regulations start to push them closer together, it leaves us all to wonder, what is the right balance? What do you value more in the place you put your money? More choice or more stability?